So has everyone seen my slide here?
Yeah.
Great. So I want to present to you all today the kind of essentials of the climate action plan ahead of the release of the first draft, which is coming up in the next few weeks. So this is the first time that we've kind of talked about specifically what's going to be in the plan to the public. So I'm excited to share this all with you. I want to give some background. I know I've presented here at 350 Humboldt before, and some of you have been letting me know that you saw the presentations that I've given to city councils. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just assuming that some of you are new to this project, is anyone here? I guess maybe that's not. I won't Q&A the room. That would be nice if we were in person. But so this is the high-level timeline of the project, where we started from and where we're headed. So the Regional Climate Action Plan project was launched in 2018 or early 2019, actually, I think. And we set off to tackle those the inventory and forecast, and then develop some measures for the climate action plan. And we spent a couple of years doing those things. And it was a big task to figure out first where emissions are coming from in Humboldt County, and then trying to develop using, best practices and, climate science, what are the most effective measures to reduce those emissions. And we've kind of wrapped that up, and we're working on the first draft, just finishing it. And following the completion of the first draft, we'll have to go through the California Environmental Quality Act review process. And then ultimately we'll have public hearings at each city and the county for this plan to be adopted. And we're building upon existing efforts in Humboldt County. So these are some climate action planning efforts that predate this regional climate action plan. City of Arcata has a greenhouse gas reduction plan. Trinidad had a draft climate action plan prepared. I don't think they ever adopted it. The county had its first foray into climate action planning as an offshoot of the general plan update. That was a draft that was never adopted. And the Hoopa Valley Housing Authority has a climate action plan. And the city of Blue Lake developed a climate action plan through a grant from the state, but it was never adopted. So these are some existing efforts. You can sort of see that there's a trend here of plans being prepared and not being adopted. And I won't get into why I think that's the case, but we're definitely designing this project to kind of build upon these efforts. And the goal is to get this plan adopted by each city council. And I'm pretty, I and the rest of the project team are doing everything we can to try to make that happen. So I want to jump into the greenhouse gas data. 2015 is our proxy year for, current greenhouse gas emissions levels. It's the most recent year that we could get all the data that we needed. So transportation is the #1 source of emissions in Humboldt County. That's not a surprise to any of you, I'm sure, but it accounts for 53% of total emissions. Stationary combustion is another major source. That refers to the use of fossil fuels like natural gas and propane, primarily in buildings. Electricity consumption is another major source, as well as livestock and industrial sources, solid waste, wastewater treatment, and leaked refrigerants. I'd like to pause here. Does anyone have any questions about this inventory? Okay, great. Then I'll move on. This is some more in-depth data here. I want to call out a couple things. The first is the bottom 2 bars. So you'll see that natural gas is referring to building energy. So the natural gas from PG&E hookups that we have, many of us have in our homes to power appliances and heat our homes, that is relatively comparable to the emissions from electricity consumption. So it's important to recognize here that building energy and this source of emissions that isn't talked about as much as electricity consumption, the use of natural gas in our homes, it's a really significant source of emissions that we need to target. And then you can see as you move up the chart that gasoline is, if you break down transportation emissions by fuel, gasoline is the biggest culprit, you could say, and then diesel is also significant. This is the breakdown of emissions by jurisdiction. Nothing too surprising here. It basically correlates to population share, but it is it's worth mentioning that the county has the unincorporated areas have basically all of the livestock operations are located within the unincorporated areas. So that's why the unincorporated county has 60% here of total emissions. The population share for the unincorporated areas is something like 53%, I think. So for the county where I work, livestock is something that we sort of need to look at for our portion of this climate action plan. Okay, this is where it gets a little more nitty-gritty data stuff. And I'd like to just kind of walk through this graph because this shows in one visual what the climate action plan accomplishes. So I'm going to walk through it starting, moving down in the legend. So first, we're going to look at business as usual emissions. So that line in the chart starts in the year 2015. So it's a projection. Everything you see to the left of it, that is historical data that we have on greenhouse gas emissions. So as you move forward along that business as usual emissions or BAU line, you'll see that if no action was taken by the state or our local governments, emissions would rise between 2015 and 2040. And that is basically just due to moderate population growth. And that scenario isn't really realistic because the state is taking aggressive action, the federal government as well, potentially. And our local governments have a role to play too. So moving down, we have this, what we're calling the legislative adjusted business as usual emissions. So that's taking the scenario where nothing happens in terms of climate action planning and adding some, actions that we're forecasting will happen. We're not talking about the climate action plan here. We're talking about more what the state is going to do and what Redwood Coast Energy Authority, our local energy provider, is going to do. So you can see that reduces emissions a significant amount. We're factoring in lots of different state regulations here. I could get into that, but I'd rather just kind of keep moving along. And if anyone has any questions, then just feel free to butt in. So the next thing I want to point out is the climate action plan total emissions reductions. So that is the diamonds, I guess, you see there on that line. And it's starting in the year, well, it really starts in the year 2021, when this climate action plan gets adopted. So we see there that trend going further down. You can see that the emissions reductions from this climate action plan that we're proposing are pretty significant. If you factor in what the state is going to do, it gets us basically halfway to the SB 32 target, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And the climate action plan kind of bridges the gap. It gets us from around halfway to reaching the target by the year 2030. So that distance between the lines on the chart that you see there, that's what we need to accomplish if we're going to reach the state target for this climate action plan. And now I'd like to talk about I'm going to just skip a couple slides and go straight to the state targets. So this is what we're proposing as our greenhouse gas target for 2030 here. 40% below 1990 levels. We surveyed 1990 levels of emissions, and we're using that as our baseline just to match up with the state. And it's not, the state targets for greenhouse gas emissions are, in the grand scheme of things, pretty ambitious. You see that by the year 2045, the state has a goal of reaching carbon neutrality. Relative to other governments throughout the country and the world, that is pretty, a pretty aggressive target. But, when you look at it in terms of climate science, these targets are sort of a bare minimum of what we need to do. That being said, Humboldt County, can't shoulder, our local governments can only do so much. So this 2030 state target sort of represents, it's an ambitious goal for us. Here in Humboldt County, we have so much of our emissions come from transportation, and it's so hard to target that because our built environment is designed around cars, and it's hard to change that. We have more, ability to impact emissions in other sectors, but yeah, I just wanted to bring that up, that these targets represent pretty significant climate action commitments, but they're not, the world won't, our problem won't be solved if the state is going to reach these targets. Everyone has to do more. And I think that, working in local government, to me, these targets are this super high bar that's really hard to reach. But I can see from other perspectives, people would say, well, this is just a bare minimum. So I wanted to kind of bring up some of that discourse around greenhouse gas targets. So yes, this is the target that's recommended in the climate action plan. And moving along for some background here, this is how the climate action plan is designed. Basically, we have this big list or menu of measures, and each jurisdiction, that would be the 7 cities. So Arcata, Blue Lake, Eureka, Ferndale, Fortuna, Rio Dell, and Trinidad, as well as the county. Those are all the jurisdictions participating. Each jurisdiction is going to select its own measures based on what's feasible and what targets that jurisdiction's specific emissions portfolio. So this is kind of the design of the climate action plan. And these are some of the main categories of measures that we're proposing. So the first 2, land use planning and low carbon transportation, those target, the number 1 source, transportation emissions. And we'll see as we break down the climate action plan that, these are the two of the most important categories, especially low carbon transportation. That would be electric vehicles, as well as mode shift, moving away from single occupancy personal vehicle use to alternative forms of transportation. So that's really important to this climate action plan. And then efficiency of buildings and facilities, that is basically, lowering the carbon footprint of buildings in Humboldt County. And that's the other big thing with this climate action plan. These first 3 that you see here, if we don't, make bold and ambitious commitments in these sectors, then we won't be able to make a dent in Humboldt County's emissions. So these are the most important ones. And then of course, renewable energy generation, which targets electricity consumption related emissions, and then waste related measures. And of course, this is almost a separate topic that I could give a whole nother presentation on, the elements of our climate action plan that deal with carbon sequestration, or beyond that, improving the resilience of our natural and working lands, and climate adaptation measures as well. That's all in the climate action plan. And I don't think I really have the time to get into that today. And I'd love to come back and present that chapter of our climate action plan. But today I want to talk about what we're going to do to cut emissions. That's the big focus of my presentation today. So another thing that is an important thing to bring up here is how this all relates to the CEQA element of climate action plans. So California Environmental Quality Act is basically a process that certain projects have to go through. It's intended to inform decision makers and the public of the potential environmental impacts of projects. In the guidelines for CEQA, they basically incentivize the creation of climate action plans. They allow for this thing called streamlining, which is basically if you have a project that, let's say you're building an apartment building and it triggers CEQA, and that would mean you would have to analyze greenhouse gas emissions. And if you find that emissions are going to potentially be significant from your project, then you have to develop mitigation measures to reduce those emissions. Well, the incentive here with climate action plans is that if the jurisdiction in which your project is located has an adopted climate action plan, the project can then just basically walk through that climate action plan and incorporate everything that's applicable to the project. And if they do that, the project can then declare that the emissions from the project are less than significant. So that's the streamlining benefit of climate action plans. And it seems a little dry, I know, but this, conversation around the qualified climate action plan versus the non-qualified climate action plan, I believe it's important to address. And I know that certain members of 350 have brought it up with me, so I wanted to tackle that for a second. So basically what we're calling a qualified climate action plan is something that we can use for that streamlining. And the thing about having a cap that can be used for streamlining is that you need to meet the state targets. You can't just develop your own target and then use it for streamlining. It has to be in alignment with state planning. So it also, there's a requirement to implement the plan, to actually do something and not just let it sit on the shelf, and to monitor and update the plan. So that's the world of a qualified cap. Projects are streamlining off it, and the climate action plan is being monitored and updated. And then if with a non-qualified cap, it's not basically there's no binding requirement under CEQA to continue implementing and monitoring and updating it after it's adopted. And you can't access the streamlining benefit. So I'm presenting this because we actually don't know which route we're going to take here. It's up to the different cities, basically, if they want a qualified cap or a non-qualified cap. And behind all this is just the question, can we reach the state target? If a jurisdiction is not able to make the commitments necessary to reach the state target, which I'm going to outline in a minute, then they will not be able to have a qualified cap. So it's really up to each jurisdiction, all the cities and the county, which route they're going to take here. I'll pause. Does anyone have any questions or comments so far?
What does the tiering stand for in that last slide?
That's just a synonym for I brought up the streamlining. So projects using the cap as a reference for their environmental review. Okay, I'm glad that you all stuck with me there through all the background. I know some of that was dry, and this will maybe continue to be a little dry, but it is sort of, I just want to walk through what this plan is trying to accomplish here. And to do that, I'm going to need to present lots of numbers and lots of, kind of planning type concepts here. And I just want you to maybe raise your hands or just let me know if you have any questions as I move through here. So I want to just set the stage because I might end up, if I have the time, comparing our cap to other caps. So here's Humboldt County, right? We have a population of around 130,000 and our 2015 per capita emissions. So total emissions divided by number of people in Humboldt County is 11.3 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. If you compare that to other counties in California, that's relatively high. It's not, crazy high, but it's probably above average per capita emissions. Okay, so here's the climate action plan in one pie chart. This shows the whole pie chart here is our 2015 emissions. And the slices that you see are what we're trying to slash of those emissions with the climate action plan. And you can see that transportation is the most significant portion of our climate action plan. And then we have electricity related measures, which are super important, then building, and then waste measures are also an element here. And this visual shows you what we're hoping to reduce from 2015, basically. Here are the top 6 objectives by greenhouse gas reductions of the climate action plan. So this is basically the most important stuff in our cap. These are the 6 actions or, categories of actions that are getting us the vast majority of our emissions reductions. I'm going to walk through each of these. So the first, electrification of existing infrastructure, then zero emissions passenger vehicles, so electric vehicles, zero emissions freight, mode shift, which is basically a shift away from personal vehicle use to alternative forms of transportation, renewable diesel, which is an alternative fuel basically, and all electric new construction. So this is our climate action plan when it comes down to it. And of course, there's a lot more to it, but in terms of reducing emissions, which is the focus of this presentation, these are the most important elements of our cap. And this is a visual basically of how much those 6 measures I showed are responsible for greenhouse gas reductions. So if you just look at that 14%, the green slice, that's the rest of the climate action plan. And then all the other slices of the pie are those 6 measures that I just showed. And this doesn't include mode shift. That was a mistake. So that green slice of the pie would actually be smaller if we included mode shift.
Connor, it looks like Mary has her hand up.
Yeah. Hey, Mary.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have no idea what renewable diesel means.
Yeah, it's kind of something that I only learned about through this project, and I'm surprised it's not more of a common topic of conversation when it comes to climate action solutions. I'll definitely get to that when we get to the slide. It's basically it's an available fuel. They sell it here in Humboldt County already. I think it's some renter stations. I'm not sure, but basically, it's the benefit of it is that you don't have to have a special engine or a special car to use it. It's a substitute for regular diesel fuel, and I think it's made out of some sort of biomass. I actually not sure. Is Katie? Are you here? Is Katie? Yeah, Katie is here. Katie, where does renewable diesel come from? I don't want to say the wrong thing here.
You're right that it's so it can be produced from things like crop residues, woods, grasses. So it's a biofuel, and it qualifies under the Renewable Fuel Standard programs. And if you're interested in learning more about low carbon fuels and renewable diesel, there's some planning on the RCA's website. So there's a, I think it's, I forget what the document is, but if you go under low carbon fuels, there's a couple planning documents that are really helpful and that provide a lot of context for renewable diesel, locally sources of renewable diesel, and yeah, that sort of thing. So I can drop that link in the chat once I find the document.
Thanks, Katie. And Katie, by the way, has been a consultant on this project and is, responsible for a lot of the work that I'm presenting today. So I just want to give that recognition. She's a core part of the project team that consists of, myself and a couple, someone else at the county, as well as staff from Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and then a couple consultants, and Katie's one of those. So thanks, Katie. Yeah, I'm going to dive into these 6 measures now. So here are our goals for electrification of existing infrastructure. By 2030, 50% of homes that currently use natural gas transition to electric, 50% of homes that currently use propane transition to electric, and 50% of commercial square footage transitions to electric. So this is a hugely important climate action plan measure, because Humboldt County is not a place where, development is constantly happening. And, according to the data that we have, in the next 10 years, basically we're not adding to the housing or commercial building stock that much. So we need to target existing buildings with the climate action plan. And so these are pretty ambitious goals. I want to compare them to the state goals. I think I forget what agency did this, but there's basically there are 2 scenarios that are recommended for the state to be able to reach its greenhouse gas target. These are 2 potential goals for the state in terms of electrification of existing infrastructure. So it's the moderate scenario here is comparable to our climate action plan, 50% replaced on burnout. So when, an appliance is done, and 5% early retirement. So targeting, people who don't necessarily need to swap out their natural gas water heater, for example, but, there are ways to kind of incentivize people retiring their appliances early and switching to electric appliances. And then that's the aggressive scenario, which is 90% replace on burnout, 70% early retirement. And, this is the kind of realistic side of the state's greenhouse gas targets. This is what the state's going to have to do to meet its targets. And Humboldt County is going to hopefully play a role in that by adopting this climate action plan and kind of adopting targets that are comparable to the state's targets. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to swap out 50% of all existing homes? I guess let's look at the gut. How are we going to transition 50% of existing homes and commercial square footage to electric by 2030? So there are ways to kind of get into the, we can't just make a requirement for every person in their home or 50% of people to swap out their appliances, because there's no leverage that local governments have there. Instead, the goal here is to really incentivize. Like the first option here, require buildings to be electrification ready at the time of sale, or if a remodel or renovation requires a permit. That's something that we can do. That's more of like the regulatory side. But really what we need to do is ramp up our incentives for people to swap out for electric appliances. And there are 3 examples here. So on-bill financing, I'm not super, Katie's more familiar with that than I am, but I guess that's RCEA provides our energy, and there's a way that, you can finance or, pay off the cost of these electric appliances through, your electricity bill. And there are other incentives here. So this is a big lift, but we'll have to make a big dent in existing buildings' use of natural gas and propane if we're going to reach our climate goals. So moving on to zero emissions passenger vehicles. By 2030, 31% of passenger vehicles in Humboldt County are ZEVs. So that would be, we're considering plug-in hybrid vehicles as well as electric vehicles as ZEVs. So that's a big goal. Katie, is it like around 1% that is ZEVs now, or less than 1%?
Yeah, that sounds right. I can find that number, but yeah, it's very low.
So it seems crazy, right? Going from 1% to 31% in 10 years. But again, we need to put these actions into context with state actions to kind of fire us up to be able to reach these goals. So the state targets, first of all, by 2035, the state is going to require all new vehicle registrations to be electric vehicles. So that will be ramped up as we approach 2035. And then in terms of their target is for 28% of all on-road vehicles in California to be electric vehicles. So in this case, we're actually adopting a more ambitious target than the state. And the reason for that is that we have a huge amount of transportation emissions, and we need to, in developing the model, we basically determined that we need to take it a little further and have that target of around 30% adoption. So how are we going to get there? Well, first of all, not every jurisdiction in the county has in their zoning regulations requirements or any information about EV ready construction. Arcata does. The county doesn't, though. So that is one thing that local governments can do. This idea of a cash for clunkers program, it's something that happens through other air quality management districts where people can turn in their high emissions vehicles and receive, I don't know if it is actually cash, but some sort of financing for an electric vehicle. We also need to, a huge part of this is just we need to expand our charging station network. So there are a number of ways to do that. And RCEA has sort of mapped out how we need to, build out our charging station network. And in adopting this climate action plan, the cities and the county are kind of jumping on board with that and saying, we're going to do everything we can to try to reach RCEA's goals for charging stations. So these are some implementation actions from our climate action plan for this category. Okay, now on to zero emissions freight. This is hugely important because a lot of our on-road emissions in Humboldt County are from freight vehicles. So we basically determined that we wouldn't be able to reach the state target unless we made a dent in that source of emissions. So the goal here is to have 3,632 zero emissions on-road freight trucks by 2030. And this one is, less fleshed out. And I'd love to hear any thoughts or ideas for this measure, because we know that we need to do it if we're going to reach our emissions goals, but we haven't, fully thought through how we're going to do it. And I want to also put this into context with the state's target. So it seems like, going back here, 27% of all trucks on Humboldt County that, travel through Humboldt County would be zero emissions. So that seems totally crazy, right? Because, it's not something that is anywhere near, common to see a zero emissions freight truck. But the technology is, rapidly developing. I believe heavy duty freight trucks are still in the pilot stages, but the technology is there for lighter duty trucks. And it's also important to look at the state's targets because, again, we have something that represents sort of the way of the future. So there's this requirement that manufacturers are required to sell zero emissions trucks as an increasing percentage of their annual sales starting in 2024. So here we see that zero emissions truck sales need to be 55 to 75% of total sales, depending on the type of truck by 2035. So the state is doing a lot of work here, and it's doing it through regulation. So this really is the way of the future. And putting our goal into context with this state, legislation makes it a little more feasible. So their projection is 6% of freight trucks will be ZEVs by 2030. So our goal is really accelerated beyond that. And yeah, my message on this one is that it's just something that we need to tackle in Humboldt County if we're going to really reduce emissions. And this is not a type of measure that I've seen in other climate action plans, but we're really unique in terms of counties. I mean, we could talk about that forever, but it's different in other jurisdictions that don't have as much, basically Humboldt County is huge and there's a lot of transportation that happens here. And it's a huge, it kind of keeps me up at night sometimes because it seems impossible, but we have to be able to tackle this if we're gonna make a dent in transportation emissions. So yeah, basically we haven't fully fleshed this out yet, but somehow we need to incentivize the replacement of aged out gas or diesel trucks with the ZEV alternative. This is something that if we have time for discussion, it'd be fun to talk about this. I'm going to do a time check right now, 6:58. Okay, so I've gotten through 3 of the key measures. Let's see. I don't want to go too far beyond 7. So I'm going to try to make it through all of the measures and then we can just wrap it up. I'm almost there. So renewable diesel, we talked about this briefly. So the goal here is by 2030 for 15% of all diesel consumption from retail or commercial vehicles to be renewable diesel. And that would have to be supported by around 36 fueling stations. So one thing we can do is kickstart the kind of availability and feasibility of renewable diesel by all the cities purchasing renewable diesel to fuel municipal vehicles. That would basically create a demand and make it more feasible ultimately for other people to purchase and have renewable diesel available. And the reason why this is an important element of our cap, we saw in the emissions chart that I showed earlier that diesel consumption is, a super significant source of emissions. So again, this is all designed on specific conditions in Humboldt County. And I think that our cap is really unique, honestly. So, these 2 measures I've shown, renewable diesel and heavy duty freight, those aren't things that you typically see addressed in climate action plans, but we know we need to do something about it if we're gonna, reach our goals. And finally, I think this is the last one I have, all electric new construction. So I mentioned that Humboldt County is not necessarily, going to experience a boon in development over the next 10 years. That being said, it is really important to, establish quickly that, future housing stock needs to be all electric starting as soon as possible. I mean, basically the age of natural gas and propane hookups is kind of coming to an end. And in Humboldt County, we're through this climate action plan, we're hoping to have the jurisdictions adopt this goal of by 2030, 100% of new construction is designed all electric. And that is super in line with the state's goals because that's a state target here, 100% of new construction to be all electric. It's the way of the future, as we've seen with a few of these other measures. And it's important for Humboldt County to, walk in step with the state on this one. So that's a huge part of our cap. And the way that we make that happen is really simple, actually. It's to adopt into local building codes an ordinance that requires all electric design for new construction. And along with that, we also we can't just put that burden on developers. So if jurisdictions go that route, we are recommending that they pair it with, actions to help build the capacity of developers to be able to become more well-versed in all electric design and construction. Yeah, and then there's mode shift, which is super important. We've talked so much about alternative fuels so far, but I'm sure some of you are thinking, wait, why don't we just forget cars altogether? And that's, mode shift is an important part of this effort to reduce transportation emissions. And here's our goal to reduce VMT by 14%. And the state targets, they have a target for mode shift here, 15% below business as usual by 2050. So ours is a little more ambitious given that the target year is 2030. We have a bunch of implementation actions for this. This is a huge part of our climate action plan that I sort of wish I had more time to really talk about, but these are some of the most significant actions under mode shift. So car sharing, that's not really something that's here in Humboldt County. It's not that common. I know that Arcata has some car share. I forget the name of it, but anyway, so one way to incentivize or promote car share is to require car share parking in new development, sort of like a if you build it, they will come thing. And then this is another really important one, a community-wide subsidized transit pass program, reaching up to 15% of residents. And that could happen through, multifamily housing, a number of ways that we can, try to get subsidized transit passes to people who are, living close to transit. Okay, and then those are two more mode shift related actions. And then to summarize this, these are the measures that I've talked about today. And I guess the theme of my message to all of you today is that Humboldt County has a huge task ahead if it's really to make a dent in emissions because of specific things, the unique nature of our county, the, overwhelming sometimes transportation sector of emissions is very hard to tackle, but we need to make a dent in it. And then building energy is the other big one. And our goals here are ambitious, but they're not out of step with what the state is doing. And that's the message that we're trying to get across to decision makers and to the public. And I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, and many of you might say this isn't enough. And I wouldn't argue with that, but the message here that we're trying to share is that it's sort of the way of the future, and that Humboldt County has an opportunity to leverage what the state is doing and to get in line with it and sort of kind of not be behind the way of the future, I guess you could say. And I'm feeling optimistic at this stage in the process. We've had collaboration between all the cities for almost 3 years now, and we're getting ready to release this document in the next few weeks, I think, maybe the second week of July. And there's a lot more to the climate action plan that I didn't get to today. So I'm looking forward to sharing the document with all of you. And what I really hope is that you can all reach out to me. I'm going to leave my email in the chat with any comments that you have on the climate action plan. And I'm always available just for phone calls. I really like getting phone calls from people and talking through things. So I'm always available to talk through this stuff and to field any comments or edits or ideas you have after you read the climate action plan. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. Thanks.